Julia Hardenburger has always loved the glamour and beauty of decades past. She's inspired by them, and they guide her personal style and taste. It has led her to find her true calling in life, which is fashion design.
Okay. When I was a little girl, like most little girls do, I loved to play dress up. The difference between the other girls and myself is that I never stopped playing. To this very day, I still see my wardrobe as a giant play chest. Even at the age of 4, I had quite the taste for fashion. Today, I will be showing my personal collection of unique vintage fashion going by decade. I think my first introduction into fashion in general would be with my jewelry business, Little Owl Designs, which I have owned since the ripe old age of 8 years old. Making jewelry my whole life has really impacted me and directed me into the fashion industry, particularly with the love of all things vintage and one of a kind. This began the process of cultivating and creating my own personal style. My first experience at making fashion into an actual job would be working at Voila, which is a vintage store inside of Pizzacco's. I did the displays and showcases in the store and got to learn about the brands and names of designers according to the era of the garment. Plus, my paycheck usually came in the form of beautiful clothing, and I never complained about that. My first job as a stylist of vintage fashion was actually for the Follies, which didn't happen that long ago. This was a great opportunity for me. I styled the 1940s housewife number, and I really had to be creative to see how modern clothing can be accessorized and translated to appear vintage. For the 1920s, this is my flapper outfit. The day I wore this, I was dressed up for Halloween at school. People didn't actually recognize that this was a costume. They just thought it was Julia being Julia. Also, that same day I had a history test over the Roaring '20s, and I was the only one who dressed up for the occasion. The 1930s was not a high decade for fashion because of the Depression hit, and people did not have extra money to spend on clothing. Because of this, they usually made everything by hand. Oftentimes, grain sacks were repurposed and used as material. But the 30s was also the golden age of Hollywood, and filled with bias-cut silk gowns for stars who could afford them. The 1940s was a balance of comfort and glamour. At the beginning of the 40s, it was highly influenced by World War II, which really changed the way women viewed fashion. Women grew to have more power in society and especially in the workforce. Suits and separates were often worn, and colors were generally muted or neutral. One thing that especially disrupted the industry was the rationing of different fabrics. One of these was a Japanese silk used heavily in making hosiery. Oftentimes, women would draw lines on the back of their legs to give the illusion of wearing hose. But by the end of the 40s, women began bringing back brighter colors and feminine silhouettes. The 50s are probably one of my favorite decades, and I own lots of garments from that era. In the far left is a Rosie the Riveter style that had carried over from the 40s, and jeans were becoming more common in everyday style. But the 50s was also a prime era for flirtatious dresses and feminine silhouettes with lots of pinks and reds. Circle skirts were very trendy because they were full and flirty, which was perfect for swing dancing. This one is my favorite pieces, and I am wearing it tonight, which actually doesn't really fit in my car, so that was difficult. I love vintage for many reasons, but I especially enjoy the thought that someone before me has loved the garment and have made many memories in it, and now it is my turn to do the same. This is a 1950s peignoir set, which was either worn as a nightwear or dressing robe. Peignoir sets were originally introduced in the 1800s, when women would be allowed to lounge comfortably without wearing a corset. It is true, by the way, that history will repeat itself when it comes to fashion, though I am hoping we can leave the 80s in the past. This slide shows some of my most special finds from traveling. On the right is a 1950s Valentino skirt that I found at a great show called Junk Stock that I attend and sell my jewelry at every summer. On the right is a Yves Saint Laurent circle skirt that I found while visiting France at a brocante market. The 50s were known to have a wandering waistline, with half the women wanting to go back to the wasp waist style and the other half wanting to completely forget the constraint on the waist. The two outside dresses show a typical silhouette with a tight-fitting high waist and a full skirt, and the middle with a dropped waist and a T-length skirt. The 1960s had a lot of variation in designs from beginning to end. In the beginning, they were similar to those of the late 50s, and by the late 60s, they had a mind and style of their own. It is not a far stretch to say that women's fashion turned more masculine and men's fashion turned more feminine during this time. Bright floral prints were used heavily. Paisleys were another popular print, and metallics were used more often. I recently scored on some extremely groovy bright orange 60s chunky heels, and you know you may have a problem when you have to assign a specific shelf for each decade of shoe you own. Oh, the 70s. I mean, what can I say? I think the bright cherry red double knit sailor jumpsuit says it all. I think I can only pull that one off when I'm in LA, but the 70s were the poster child for weird and bright color combinations and no real rules or boundaries for how bizarre fashion got. I only have this one thing from the 80s for 3 reasons. 1, it simply isn't vintage yet. 2, I admire the 80s hair, but other than that, it was a really rough time for fashion. And 3, if I did consider it vintage, there could be a lot of people in this room that would be mad at me. This slide shows how makeup has evolved over the decades. The 20s was a very theatrical style with pale skin and heavy doll-like eyes, bow lips, and bright cheeks. The 40s and 50s styles were similar, but the 50s really introduced the cat-eye eyeliner and naturally blushed cheeks. So if there is one thing that my style and clothing taught me, it would be a lesson in confidence and becoming comfortable in my own skin. The ability to stand out in normalcy. It has gave me the ability to be shamelessly bold. A favorite quote from a mentor once said, "Dress shabbily and they remember the dress. Dress impeccably and they remember the woman." Coco Chanel. This obsession of mine has turned into a passion that I do intend to follow through for my future and career. If you would like to keep updated on my adventures and more vintage outfit posts, I would love for you to visit my Facebook and Instagram pages. And as I like to say, life is a party, why not dress like it? Thank you for having me.